All right. Hi, Tiffany. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. It's nice to have you
Absolutely.
here. So, right off the bat, is Tiffany Jewell your real name or is that your author name?
It's my real name. Years ago, well, when I was born, my mom gave us, my sister and I, names. So if we ever became famous, we wouldn't have to change them.
Well, that's
So,
great. Yeah, because it's a very stage kind of theatrical name, so it
yep.
works very well.
Yeah.
Before we get to your book, can you give us a little bit of your backstory, what you've been doing?
I guess I will always say, like, before I was an author, before I was a mama, I'm an educator. I've been teaching for like over 20 years at this point, mostly elementary aged kids, but I started with preschoolers. I've worked with high schoolers, middle schoolers, with educators. Um, and so my background in education, and I kind of came into becoming an author and writing by way of teaching, because I think so much of teaching is storytelling as well. Um, I identify as a Black biracial cisgender woman. I grew up in upstate New York on the homeland of the Haudenosaunee, and I'm the proud mama of two young storytellers who keep growing and growing faster than I'd maybe like them to.
Was there something that happened during your teaching that inspired you to start writing?
Yes and no. So, working with children, I am a trained Montessori educator, and a lot of the lessons that I taught kids really came from telling stories. We would start with the creation of the earth, and then kind of the coming of life, um, and move into stories of like the history of writing and the history of numbers. And so I created a story for my students, kind of on the history of justice, really looking at it through the lens of racism and anti-racism. Um, and from there, my first editor with this book is anti-racist, like she'd been following me on Instagram and messaged me and emailed me and was like, "Hey, would you ever consider writing a book for children?" And at that point, I never thought about writing books. Like I wrote stories for my students, but never really thought beyond my classroom or beyond school. At the time, I was also creating curriculum for teachers that folks use across the country in some places, but never really uh, thought of myself as an author.
Funny you mentioned Montessori because my mother told me that I was a Montessori kid, and
Oh, nice.
as old as I am, they've been around a long time.
Yeah, for over 100 years, from what I remember. In the United States, Montessori came to the United States in the 1960s, but has been around longer than that in Italy and India and other parts of the world.
Well, it must have been new because I was born in 62. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it was. What's the premise of it? I don't remember a thing about it.
um, it's a really beautiful way of honoring children. We kind of meet children where they are. If you go into classrooms, they're beautiful. They have like wooden materials because, especially with younger students, we're teaching them like didactic materials and how to like navigate their world and give them language like this is big, bigger, biggest. And as we move into elementary, kids kind of get a sense of that the world is bigger than they are, but everybody has an important role to play in the world. And we move from like concrete materials and thoughts to like much more abstract and bigger things. I really was drawn to it as a teacher because it allowed me to follow the child, and not have to teach the same thing to every kid at the same time. I gave a lot of individual lessons, and I had students in my classroom for 3 years. So I got to build relationships with them and their caregivers and get to know them, which was really awesome. And it's a really sweet way to teach
Well, it sounds
children.
interesting. It sounds more like
Yeah.
a individual approach to education rather than a one size fits all
Yep.
for everybody, one
Yeah.
curriculum. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, I wish I remembered more about it, but I think I was, 3 years old at
Yeah.
best. Let's pivot over to your book because our time is quickly going away. So,
Oh my
everything
goodness.
I learned about racism, I learned in school. The title is pretty self explanatory, but tell me what to expect in the book if I was to pick it
Mm.
up.
The book is part memoir, so it is a good chunk of my schooling journey from like elementary all the way to college. And so that's from like 1984 to 2003, primarily in upstate New York. That's actually, it's all in upstate New York when I think about it, or central New York. And then I also move into some historical aspects looking at very specific things like military recruitment in schools, tracking, and magnet schooling. And then I also have about 16 contributors, other authors and educators, and some students who have shared their stories about an aspect of their schooling that reflects the title, when they encountered racist acts or reflecting on racism that they experienced or witnessed when they were younger.
When you refer to racism, are you referring to individual people or the institution generally speaking?
The definition I always use is so it's like two things: it's personal prejudice and bias, and it's the misuse and abuse of power by institutions. So I'm really looking at both, and in some instances, um, I know in my first book, I shared kind of like something that happened in my class when I was in third grade. And that was more of a like personal prejudice and bias that the teacher enacted. And then like the institution misused and abused their power by allowing her to stay in the classroom and be our teacher. So it's really like looking at both of those. Um, I think this book is really for those kids who read my first book and are like, now let's look at school, because this is the institution that I'm like in every day, pretty much.
You want to tell us what happened, or do you want people to buy the book and read it?
Buy the book and read, but it was just my kind of in third grade, developmentally, when I'm looking outwards to the world and noticing more than just my family and my friends. I had a teacher that definitely treated Black and Brown students very differently from white students, and is in the way she it was in the things she said and the way she acted. And like, I don't want to I'm actually like not allowed to get into very specific things, but I remember going home and talking to my mom about them, and and then being shocked that she was like at school the teacher was at the school the next day. It's like, I can't believe she said this to my friend and then she's still here. And that's when I kind of like started realizing that school is like not safe for everybody, and that while the teacher's actions weren't great, like the school should have done something to protect the like student. We were 9 years old, but nothing happened other than we felt like harmed.
What do you think we can do to improve the climate in public schools these days?
Yeah, and it's also like, I want to say too, because I worked in a private school, like it's
So it's not just public school. Yeah,
many,
okay.
no, it's not just public school. Like private schools also have their thing, and homeschool, like all, like just schooling as an institution is not working because um we're doing things the way they've always been done. But kids now more than ever are like smarter and savvier and more aware of what's happening in the world. And every time, like, I work with a lot of kids and throughout the country, and one of the things I always ask them is like, what do you need? And they always tell me more often than not that they need more time and space to understand who they are, to understand their identities, to understand the people around them, to be able to talk about injustice and think of ways, and not just think of ways, but to enact like change. And I think if school could be a place where kids could spend more time learning about themselves and understanding who they are and being able to embark on those like inquiries without judgment, I think school could be a pretty awesome place for most people.
Teachers do have to go through some kind of a DEI training,
Hmm.
don't they, at this point?
Hmm. I think so. I hope so. And it really like, I mean, that's one of the things is like every teacher education program is different. And really like almost all of the teachers I work with and I connect with are incredible and are doing everything they possibly can in a system that is pretty static. And so like while we as people are like dynamic and we can change and stuff, we're in a system that hasn't really changed in hundreds of years.
Okay, can you give me one example of that, of something that hasn't
Mm.
changed?
I mean, I look now and like we have people are like clawing back and ethnic studies are being taken out of schools. You know, we've had in different parts of the country not wanting to teach Black history or African American history, not wanting to teach or books being taken out of classrooms, book bans. And this is all stuff that's happened before. And then people have fought to like get these programs into schools. And now we're like going backwards and they're being taken out of schools again. And I also look at like standardized testing, which hasn't really changed. And we don't really need, I personally believe like we don't need standardized testing to be able to see where children are. And it's one of those things like, oh, this is what we've always used to assess students and to figure out like if schools are passing or failing without like recognizing like we should be looking at students in different ways and not always in like a deficit model. Um, and it's really frustrating because there's so much potential, but there's like no money being put into our schools to make them better. There's being more put on teachers. There's like contention between caregivers and teachers. Like the environment is not great at setting students up for success in our country.
What do you think? This will be the last question because we're kind of running down on time. What do you think would be one good example of something the teachers in the educational system can do to prepare kids for success?
I think listening to students more, and like if we could have more time where students get to ask questions about the things they really want to know. Because as a mother, I know my children like come home and they're like processing what they learned in school and they have questions. And if they don't ask them or if we don't engage them, they're coming up with their own answers, which are often based in stereotypes and which are untrue. And then that just kind of like perpetuates like this like unknowing and fear and division. And I think if we can kind of allow for more space, um, I think, you know, teachers will feel like better about everything. Students will. I know in my own classroom when I was able to like let go of some of the things I felt like I needed to control, like my students and I felt more ease. And then there was more trust. And then we were able to like do deeper inquiry around the bigger questions of the world. But we don't have that. And like everything's so scheduled um, because it's how it's always been in schools.
All right. Well, Tiffany, on that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wind this down. Thank you so much for coming on. Again, the book is called Everything I Learned About Racism I Learned in School. My guest is Tiffany Jewell. Last question. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
I do. It's my name, Tiffany M. Jewell, and Jewell has two L's in the end.com. That felt like the easiest thing.
Okay. And there's information about your book and
Hmm.
books, since I guess you've done more
Yeah.
than one. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was
You're
nice meeting you and
welcome.
chatting with you. Best of luck.
Yeah. Nice meeting you too.